Açılış konuşmasını yapmak üzere Danimarka Aarhus Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Doktor Sayın Knud Jorgensen'i kürsüye davet ediyorum. Simultane tercümanımız vardır. Bununla ilgili dışarıda kulaklıkları temin edebilirsiniz. Buyurun Sayın Jorgensen. Here you are please. Okuyacağım. İzninizle önce kısa bir biyografisini okumak istiyorum Sayın Jorgensen'in. Knud Jorgensen is professor in the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University. He teaches international relations theory, European foreign policy, and European studies. He has been visiting professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Research, European University Institute Florence. He was program chair of the World International Studies Committee's Konferansı in Ljubljana in 2008. He is a member of the advisory boards of IBEI, Barcelona, and the European program at Bilgi University. Moreover, he chairs the CPR Standing Group on International Relations and is former editor of Cooperation and Conflict, co-editor of the Palgrave Studies in International Relations and associate editor of Journal of European Integration. He has been a member of numerous PhD committees throughout Europe. Publications include authored and edited books, including the European Union and International Organizations, International Relations Theory, A New Introduction, Handbook of European Union Politics, Handbook on the European Union and International Institutions, Performance, Policy and Power. He has taken part in numerous national and international research projects, including projects under the EU's 6th Framework Program, the European Science Foundation and the Volkswagen Foundation. Thank you. Here you are, please.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and distinguished Rector, distinguished Undersecretary, distinguished colleagues and students. I'm very honored to be invited to give this keynote address to the conference. Usually we are being told not to jump to conclusions, but I'll make an exception here and actually first outline my conclusion and then tell you subsequently how I arrived at the conclusion. So the title of my talk is whether the crisis of the European Union in world politics is getting critical. It is for sure not common to see member states increasingly sending letters to the High Representative in which they criticize her thoroughly, her being Catherine Ashton. It is also not common that the EEAS, the European Union's External Action Service, is surrounded by increasing frustration and by promises unfulfilled. Clearly, in addition, the European economic debt crisis is attracting increasing attention, and European foreign policy suffers for that reason. The European Union is not that present in the Middle East, it is not that present in the Far East, and it's not that present in the East in between the Far and the Middle. And that's quite a chunk of land. Not to speak about the Americas, whether it's Latin America or it's North America, and the Global South also. The European Union is not that present as it could be. So maybe the crisis is getting critical. But in my view, it takes more than bold claims and generalizations, sweeping generalizations, to really arrive at a rigorous conclusion. And it is for that reason I would like to take you through some steps where I explain how I reached this conclusion that yes, the crisis might get critical, but it is not necessarily too early to tell, but it is necessary to talk about how we see this being critical. So let me go back to the beginning of my talk, namely the introduction. In my view, the title of this conference is a very well-chosen title. Although, of course, I don't hope that it will remain a well-chosen title, because I would wish away the crisis part of it, at least when it comes to the European Union. But to talk about crisis and critique in one combination, I think, is very well chosen. Of course, our analysis of the crisis is bound to have an impact on our assessment of the European Union in world politics. We don't know yet if the euro is capable of being saved. We don't know if the euro goes down the drain, what will happen to the European Union as such. It is too early to tell. So to every talk about the European Union, there is a kind of angst, existential angst dimension to it. We don't know if it will survive. And that is a pretty difficult situation to be in. There's a second reason I find the title for this conference very apt, and that is that it is a title with a pedigree. When I saw the title of the conference the first time, I immediately somehow was thinking of a famous book. After all, I'm an academic. So I was thinking about Koselleck's famous book from, I think, the 1960s, Crisis and Criticism, in which he describes, analyzes thoroughly the genesis of civil society in Europe. And he points out, emphasizes time and again, the key importance of being critical for the genesis of civil society as we know it today. So I think this is a very nice coincidence that there is this overlap in terms of title. He also points out that critique and criticism is actually a condition for progress. So if we are not critical, the likelihood of progress diminishes. In addition to that, criticism, in my view, is a duty or an obligation for academics. We build up knowledge, and based on all this knowledge that we build up, it is our obligation to be critical of things, political or cultural. So we should speak truth to power. Now, in my talk, I'll focus entirely on the European Union in world politics. That is, as an international actor, I'll be talking about the European Union's performance in world politics and such issues. The first area I would like to focus on, or the first kind of literature I would like to focus on, is what I call the declinist literature. My comment about this is that, in a way, it's a funny world, because only some 5, 6, 7 years ago, books were published, articles were published, and at that time, only 5, 6 years ago, titles were radically different from the titles you see published today. At that time, titles were such as The European Dream, author Jeremy Rifkin, having spent a year or two in Brussels, being American, and describing what he had observed and telling his American audience about this fantastic European dream that at the time was almost sort of substituting the American dream, the best American dream that you can imagine. Now he was talking about the European dream. He had some competitors in terms of this kinds of books. There's one author who had chosen to give his title, the title Superstate Europe, and the challenge it gives to the United States. A third author had chosen the title Bound to Lead, the European Union in World Politics. This is not a kind of title that you come across these days. So different. I guess the winner of this competition of optimistic, forward-looking titles where people were optimistic on behalf of the European Union is probably the one by Leonard Reinhardt, where the title is Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. Quite a bold claim, right? And that is 5-6 years ago that it was published. I don't know exactly how he looks at the world today, but he is very much involved in European foreign policy, so he might have some very good reasons for why he chose the title at the time and how it has changed in the meantime. Because now the mood is very different, so different. There has been an avalanche of books and articles and blogs published. There are some examples. Richard Young's, for example, let me find the title, which is very it's almost a recycled title. It's about Europe's rise and fall. So this is not about the Roman Empire, this is about the European Union, the rise and fall of the European Union. And he's not alone in choosing such titles. Other authors are using the same title but then with a different subtitle. One is, for example, writing a book about Europe's slow mood political suicide. Quite drastic words to put on a book title. And others are even more radical because they are writing an epitaph to an old continent. So they see Europe's progress or future as being nowhere. It's sort of a dead end, a blind alley. They have a very common diagnosis that Europe is challenged, and they also point out all the weaknesses that you can imagine when it comes to Europe. Seemingly, according to these books and articles, there's no end to Europe's problems. Or, for that matter, you could ask if this is a constant. Is it something that has always characterized Europe's reflections on itself, or Europeans' reflection on themselves? Because after all, it is almost soon 100 years ago, Oswald Spengler published his famous book, 1922, about Der Untergang des Abendlandes, the decline of the countries towards the West, meaning Europe. So increasingly declining out of the center. So maybe there's a constant to this. Maybe it's nothing new. But still, it's amazing to watch as an observer how things can change so radically in just a few years, from hot to not, in just 5, 6, 7 years. Or maybe it's so European-less self-criticism. Maybe we simply love to be self-critical. Maybe we can characterize ourselves as a continent of flagellants who like to whip ourselves with pointing out, emphasizing all the weaknesses, all the challenges that characterize our continent, and never look into something that we can actually be proud of. This has merits some further discussion. Because it's also a funny world in a different sense. The reason it is a funny world in a second sense is that in parallel to all this declinist literature, where Europe's future looks very bleak, you find an equally impressive set of literature which focus entirely on European power. So there is simply no end to how many different forms or kinds of power that, according to these authors, Europe can be characterized by. Of course, the notion of civilian power has been with us for 40 years. And it's incredible how long-lasting such a relatively brief or short article published 40 years ago can still have in terms of triggering our imagination about what is actually characterizing Europe. So Duchenne, the one who coined the notion of civilian power Europe, is still with us to some degree, although people are getting increasingly critical towards Duchenne's hypothesis. Then, of course, the notion of military power Europe has also been with us for a long time, almost 30 years. But when it was originally coined in the early 1980s, it was not coined in order to characterize a state of affairs, something that characterized Europe at the time. It was more coined in order to characterize a desirable state of affairs, at least according to its author, Hedle Bull. Then, of course, for the last 10 years, we have had the notion of normative power Europe, famously coined by my colleague in Denmark, Ian Manners. And it continues, this notion of normative power Europe, to generate inspiration and criticism. So it's very much alive and kicking, this notion. It attracts ever new scholars to reflect upon it, to sometimes criticize it, and other times simply sign up and says, yes, this is of course how we should characterize Europe and also contemporary Europe as a normative power. There are other examples or suggestions as well. Transformative power is one, and I don't have time to go through all these different kinds of power that people use to characterize Europe. I've counted more than a dozen such kinds of powers. And of course, in the present context, it is not necessarily the substance of these kinds of power that has our interest. It is the contrast they provide to the kinds of literature I characterized just a minute ago, namely the declinist literature, where power is non-existent, only weakness, only inferiority, such things. And this contrast suggests to me that we have a real puzzle ahead of, not ahead of us, but in front of us. So we need to discuss who among these two groupings got it right, who got it wrong. Because can it really be that like both got it right? Are these understandings, are these reflections, are they compatible? This is something that I hope that we can spend part of the conference on discussing. So let me turn to the more critical part of my talk. I have 4 different versions to offer. The first version, or the first kind, is a criticism of the declinist literature. Because it seems to me to be only at a very superficial level that the declinists share analysis and conclusion. Some simply tell a story about Europe's rise and decline in order to make a kind of wake-up call. Wake up European politicians, because if it continues as it develops right now, well, then the fall is inevitable. But if you do make some radical new decisions, then Europe can be saved. So in this sense, this author does not present a kind of determinist view. Europe is bound to fail, is bound to disappear from world history. It's more, as I mentioned, a wake-up call. And it's done, I guess, deliberately in a very provocative fashion. And for that reason, it has also been fairly successful in attracting attention. So part of the current discourse is framed by this intervention in the ongoing discussion about Europe's role in world politics. Then there are other authors for whom it is more determinist. It's more a bleak, a necessarily bleak future that awaits Europeans. And this part of the literature is characterized by inferiority, by threat perceptions, by self-confidence being low, and especially immigration and the presence of Islam in Europe is seen as a source of Europe's political suicide. Now, if you go down this path and you go sufficiently far, you end up in a position characterizing a guy you might have heard of that is currently being tried at a court in Oslo. The guy who last summer killed 77 people because he felt threatened by the inflow of immigrants and by the politicians who, in his perception, supported this flow of immigration. So the literature, the declinist literature, can, if you take it to the sort of final consequences, can be really lethal. Then there are some parts of the declinist literature that are kind of blinded by conceptual blinders. And for that reason, they simply don't see Europe as an actor, as an acting subject. This is, for example, done often by scholars who have a leaning towards the realist tradition in international relations, the realists. And Stephen Walt, although I consider him an eminent scholar and a great realist scholar too, well, last month, or recently at least, he had a blog on Foreign Policy's website where he sort of forecasted the coming erosion of the European Union. And it made me think about how realists or scholars with a realist leaning have approached and analyzed European integration over the years. And it's quite amazing to follow how the story has evolved. Because first, they claimed that, well, we can explain the absence of European integration. This goes back to the 50s and to some degree to the 60s as well. Then, when this position were no longer feasible and sustainable, they changed the conclusion and the claim. And then they said, okay, it might be that in some corners there is some European integration, but we can explain why it is so limited. This lasted for some time, and the French and particularly Charles de Gaulle made his best to confirm this approach. But then the realists had to change claim again, and they said, well, why is there no integration in such areas as currency, taxation, and defense? Then, of course, it happened that currency became integrated, the euro was introduced, defense also became activated, became sort of a European defense dimension got on the track. So now it seems only to be taxation that has been left, and that is a pretty slim sort of reservoir for the realists to lean on. For that reason, I guess, let's change again the argumentation and say, okay, now we can predict the coming erosion of the European Union. Quite amazing how flexible this research program is. In general, the decline literature seems to be something like Spengler plus Paul Kennedy, the historian, British historian, who became famous for publishing the rise and fall of the Roman Empire in the 1980s, which was excellent timing because at the time the Americans also felt a little bit down. It was after the defeat in Vietnam. So they felt that they were going down, that they declined relatively. So Paul Kennedy, they almost sort of adopted both him and his argument. And in addition to that, there are quite a few anti-European Union sentiments in the literature. There are also even more numerous bold statements, and there are some sweeping generalizations. And if you like this menu, then go for it. In my view, this is really a pity, because decline should actually be taken serious. Ever since decolonization took place, when Europe had to give up all its colonies, there has been a development policy in place. And if you take the development policy literally and formally, then the objective of development policy is to develop the global south. If you develop the global south, Europe will automatically decline, relatively, in a world comparative context. So you could argue that, well, Europe's decline is an almost official declared policy in this sense. You can also claim that the promotion of globalization, which has been official European Union policy during the last 15, 20 years, well, so far it has lifted 400 million Chinese up to a level of living that is comparable to Western Europe. And there are quite many in India, in Indonesia, in South Korea that are looking to this very interesting experiment because they would like to repeat it. Now, if they're successful, and many indicators suggest that they are successful, then it will automatically mean or imply that Europe will relatively decline. So it is not necessarily something to deplore. It is simply what is currently characterizing developments in the world. It's what is characterizing the trends of economic development. And this was not predictable just 20 years ago, when the global south was still very south, very much in need of aid and development policy. Many areas are not in need anymore. India has declared, as you most likely know, that it is no longer considering itself to be a development country. And for that reason, they have said, well, no more development aid for us, please. We are India. The second version of criticism I would like to comment on is more internal. It's not academics or it's not think tankers who are writing books or articles. It is the essence of what could be called the politics of European foreign policy. And in order to follow my argument, I would like you to imagine a very simple, very typical political science, two-dimensional table that is 4 cells. One dimension concerns whether you have a preference for an internationalism that is backed by military means, or if you object to that. So it's a simple yes-no. The other dimension concerns cooperative internationalism, multilateralism, what is typically called. And again, you have 2 options. You can say, okay, I'm in favor of cooperative internationalism, or you are against. Now, this simple table creates clearly 4 different camps. And I would argue that most countries, and the European Union included, can be characterized when it comes to attitudes to key dimensions of foreign policy by these 2 dimensions. There are other dimensions as well, obviously, but these are always key dimensions. And you can label the 4 groupings that you produce differently, according to your preferences. But those who declare themselves in favor of both military and also cooperative internationalism are sometimes titled or labeled internationalists. Just as those people who have a preference for no military action, no cooperation please, are typically labeled isolationists. Then there are those who prefer military action but no cooperation, because cooperation only takes time and is a recipe for inaction and so on and so forth. And sometimes these people are called hardliners. And then there are those who are always eager to cooperate but never use military means. They are typically called accommodationists. Now, you can have an entire course on such a table, because it contains a lot of information about people's attitude, whether it's elite attitudes or it's a public opinion attitude towards foreign policy issues. And that is not sort of the reason I bring it up here. In the present context, I pay attention to this table simply because I'll ask you to imagine the European Union adopting an internationalist line, a policy line. So, in principle, in favor of both a military-backed internationalism but also a cooperative one, which is not too far away from what the European Union can be characterized as, and as it has demonstrated through its behavior during the last 10 to 15 years. Imagine that this is an accurate description of the European Union's policy line. Then immediately the European Union will have created 3 fierce critics of the policy line, namely the isolationists, the hardliners, and the accommodationists, who for some reason don't agree in both these questions being answered positively. This is what I mean by the politics of European foreign policy. Foreign policy is never without its contending views. There are always contested approaches to foreign policy, or different preferences for emphasis and so on and so forth. And quite a lot of the criticism of the European Union can be said to be of this nature, where it is a political preference that is different from the one pursued by the European Union, for better or worse. I'm not making any judgments here. I'm only sort of noticing how this politics, the dynamics of this kind of politics. And speaking about the isolationists, they are typically in a very bad situation in the European Union because having an objection to cooperative internationalism make them automatically skeptics of the European Union enterprise in the first place. So they have a difficult time influencing the direction of European foreign policy because they object to the European institutions in the first place. And that is kind of a self-defeating, but sometimes political preferences are self-defeating. I'll now turn to the third kind of criticism that I would like to reflect upon today. And this is the criticism that much observation of the European Union in world politics is observer-dependent. The shadow of the observer is the problem typically called. And it is a very important kind of phenomenon when it comes to analyzing foreign affairs. I'll give you some examples just to illustrate. It's quite typical when you come across officials working in the European Commission that they are fairly critical of European foreign policy. Not because they are critical of the policy as such, but because they are critical of the fact that the major part of European foreign policy is being made by intergovernmental procedures. It is the member states that are sort of the the influential actors, and the Commission is not always playing the role it would like to play. So it is not the policy as such that they criticize, but it is the way in which the policy is being made. And this, of course, should be taken into consideration by us, observers, analysts, when we sort of judge the current state of affairs when it comes to European foreign policy. A second illustrative example is that member states are typically fairly different when it comes to ambition in foreign policy. A few years ago, some colleagues of mine presented the findings concerning the European Union's performance in the field of human rights promotion in the context of the United Nations. They presented these findings to diplomats from the United Kingdom and to diplomats from Germany. And it's quite significant that the diplomats from the United Kingdom responded well. We can understand your findings, but you are way too critical. This is not entirely the whole truth about what we have achieved and what we aim at achieving when it comes to human rights promotion within the context of the United Nations. The German diplomats responded quite differently. They said, well, it's a very accurate state of affairs that you have described, and we simply have to do a better job, because apparently, implicitly, they were more ambitious. The UK diplomats found that okay, what we're doing is so-so, but we should not aim at more, and the German diplomats wanted more. So again, you have these contending evaluations of the performance of the European Union. This also applies to when we consider the new External Action Service, the Foreign Office, you could say, of the European Union, where some believe that it's simply too big and others think that it's too small. Currently, there are some 3,700 diplomats employed by the European External Action Service, and eventually it will grow up to, according to decisions made, up to 6,000. Now, is that big or is that small? I guess it depends. You can compare to the size of national foreign offices and how many diplomats typically are employed by these national ministries of foreign affairs. In the Dutch case, there are about the size of the EEAS now. Between 3,500, 4,000, it varies because cuts are also being made in the foreign services. In the French case, France employs some 12,000 diplomats. So is then the European diplomatic service, is that big or small? Well, you have to take it into relative terms. And if the ambition, and that is the ambition officially declared to be a strong actor in world politics, then it seems to me that 6,000, half the size of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is not that ambitious. And it's not that, you cannot put that much confidence into this service being able to actually perform what it is being asked to perform, to take on the tasks, to be present in all corners of the world, and at the same time address national audiences, not least national politicians. A third example of how the shadow of the observer is very important is an article I came across a couple of years ago where two American defense analysts analyzed European foreign policy. And to their big surprise, they had noticed that some people found that there actually is a European foreign policy. That was a big surprise to these analysts, because as they asked, how can there be an efficient European foreign policy when the European Union does not command an aircraft carrier battle group? Because this was sort of taking the American example automatically into their assessment of what the European Union can do and cannot do, and how efficient foreign policy can do without and with military backing. So this is the shadow of the observer phenomenon. Then the final version of the critical approach is concerning strategies and strategic objectives. And it is well known that the European Union pursues both bilateral and multilateral strategies. When it comes to the bilateral part, well, then there are the famous or infamous strategic partnerships, so far granted to two handful of countries, usually big countries like the United States, China, India, and so on and so forth, but also to some less big and future countries that are lining up for a strategic partnership, for example, includes Israel. Not that big after all. It also seems to me that the strategic partnership as a notion is increasingly a misnomer, because it doesn't really characterize what these agreements are all about. They are a kind of template that some official in the European Union at some point sort of drew on the table. And subsequently, this template has been simply copied and pasted. So instead of China, you erase China and then you put in the United States or you put in Russia. And then it is declared to be a strategic partnership. And on the big sort of festivitas, this document is being signed and everybody is happy, at least those present. But there's not much strategic partnership to it. Strategic, absolutely not. Because you don't simply copy strategies. That is, you have to have a very differentiated approach when you develop strategies towards big and important and crucially important partners throughout the world. When it comes to multilateral strategies, well, you see in literature a lot of different claims and findings, and sometimes these findings or comments are quite bold, are quite generalized. Now, last week I submitted a manuscript of a fairly big book, 30 plus chapters, 50 authors, and if there's one conclusion that comes out of this book, it is that variation is what characterizes the European Union's multilateral strategies. So what is feasible within the context of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is not feasible within the context of NATO. What is possible within the FAO is not possible within the OSCE, and so on and so forth. So bold claims and generalized findings are simply very, very difficult to make, except that variation characterizes the picture. When it comes to the European security strategy, well, then you might know that it was developed, it was decided upon back in 2003, a time that was very specific, very distinct due to the war in Iraq and the split across the Atlantic. So it was made in very specific circumstances. Now, 5 years later, 2008, it was attempted, revised, but this attempt basically failed. So what came out of it was a document that was not telling that much, because there was not that much to tell. Currently, there are some considerations about possibly revising it again. But apparently, the reluctance to revise the European security strategy is sort of winning. So it seems, for an outside observer like me, that it has been put on the low burner. It is something that is around, but if two attempts at revising a key document that at least at one time was key fails, well, then it seems to me to be an increasingly irrelevant dead letter agreement or strategy. And this contributes to the image of an actor that is very prone to ceremonial politics, to being strong on form, and often actually quite weak in terms of substance. And basically, this is the analysis that led me to the conclusion that I already presented to at the beginning of my talk. So the circle has been come full, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention and for being here today. Thank you very much.
Çok teşekkür ederiz. Sayın Jorgensen'e teşekkür belgesini vermek üzere Müsteşarımız Sayın Haluk Alacak Beyefendi'yi kürsüye davet ediyorum. Buyurun Sayın Alacak.
I thank you very much for your keynote speech, and especially for the examples which would open deep reflections during this 2 days conference on crisis European Union. And I would like, I repeat again, I'm sorry. I would like to thank you very much on behalf of the Sakarya University and on behalf of Professor Muzaffer Elmas, Rector of the Sakarya University, for your keynote speech and for the examples you have given to us today, which would open, I'm confident, for new reflections during the discussions in this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words. I'm very much looking forward to discuss with you and all your colleagues throughout the conference all sorts of issues that you would like to discuss. So I'm full at your disposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much.